Have you ever thought, why don't they teach that in school? As a teacher of 23 years myself, I noticed that students had less and less of some of the basic skills they needed for everyday life. You know, things like how to write a thank you note, how to make a phone call, how to apologize, how to write a check and balance your account, how to sew on a button, how to clean the bathroom and vacuum and do laundry, how to operate a fire extinguisher, how to turn off the water to the house. And thus, Adulting 101 was born. You can go to jamesdevine.net, click on the Adulting 101 course link, and take a view of a few free lessons. And if you like what you see, sign up for the full course, and you can get 30% off as a Cool Grandpa listener. Just enter the code COOLGRANDPA at checkout.
Hi, I am proud to have partnered with Redio. As you guys may have heard from past episodes, Redio is a great application that enables grandparents and parents to maintain and grow relationships through virtual reading of books with their grandchildren. Now, Redio does not take the place of any kind of in-person interaction or in-person reading to your grandchildren. But what it does allow for is for those remote connections when you can't be there with your grandchild every evening. Redio has well over 4,000 children's titles, and there's bound to be titles in here that you and your grandchild are going to enjoy together. There's a great way that you can build a library with your grandchild, and there's fun interactive tools within Redio that allows grandchildren to point to objects that are interesting to them, as well as you using the pointer to show objects that are interesting to you and that you're trying to express to the grandchild. So what I want you guys to do is go to thecoolgrandpa.us, look for the affiliate links on the top of the website, click on that, and then go down to the Redio links. Once you click on that, then you'll be taken to Redio where you can learn more about the application, and then you can also sign up for your free 14-day trial period. I know you're going to enjoy this application to maintain and grow those relationships when you just can't be there in person. So do yourself a favor, go to thecool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link, and then scroll down to Redio. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to hearing stories about how you've used Redio to build those connections. Hi, I want to introduce our guest today, Richard Capriola. Now, Richard, or Rick as he likes to be called, has spent 11 years working as an addictions counselor for the Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, before he retired back in 2019. Now, the Menninger Clinic is one of the top 10 psychiatric hospitals in the United States and specializes in the assessment, stabilization, and treatment of adults and adolescents with substance abuse and psychiatric disorders. We've invited Rick to come on to the Cool Grandpa podcast to share his insights about adolescent addiction, and specifically what grandparents and grandfathers in particular can play a role in the identification, the support, and even the post-treatment of adolescent addiction when it comes to our grandchildren. I mean, a lot of us feel pretty helpless when these things happen to our grandchildren. We don't know what to say, what to do, what not to say, what not to do. And so Rick is going to help us through this. Now, Rick has a couple of books that we're going to talk about. The one book in particular that we're talking about is called The Addicted Child. And I have a link for this book in the show notes. So go to cool-grandpa.us, find the show notes, and you'll see the link for The Addicted Child. And then he's also has a companion workbook, also called the Addicted Child Workbook. And the workbook is something that can help parents and grandparents work through what's going on when they suspect or they have a child that's going through addiction. This is an important topic for us because, like I said, a lot of times as a grandfather and a grandparent, we don't know what to do. I mean, parents oftentimes don't know what to do when confronted about addiction and substance abuse and substance dependencies with their children and grandchildren. what I want you guys to do is to fasten up those shoestrings if you're going out for a walk, or pull up a chair and take a listen to this fascinating conversation. Should you guys have any questions at the end of this episode, what I want you guys to do is go to the show notes, click on the comments, and leave a question there. What I will do is follow back up with Richard and get you that answer for your question. So without further ado, let's jump into this awesome conversation with Rick. Rick, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and talk with us about this very important subject of adolescent and child addiction. It's important for grandparents to understand what's going on currently and how we can be a resource to the grandkids and the parents that are going through this.
Well, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this topic. And you're absolutely right. I think grandparents can play a unique and very important role in helping parents as well as their grandkids become knowledgeable about this issue, know what the warning signs are, be better prepared to deal with this, because this can be a very scary subject for parents and for grandparents. And I think that the more knowledge that we give them, the more information they have, hopefully the better prepared and less paranoid and less afraid they'll be. And they'll just be better equipped to deal with this issue in the event that it comes up.
Right. And I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of us run into is when we have situations come up, not having the information to know how to react to it. We don't know whether, this should be, let's say, a 5 or a 10. Yeah. And sometimes, underreacting, it could almost be as bad as overreacting to situations.
It can be, I've met with many parents and gone over their child's history of using substances or alcohol. And when I went through the history of what their child was using and would give them the diagnosis of a substance use disorder, they would sometimes look at me and they would say, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they would say something like, well, I sort of suspected something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. They didn't know what the warning signs are, so they felt bad as a parent. They felt bad as a grandparent that, how did I miss all of this? Well, they missed it because nobody had taken the time to tell them what to look for and what the warning signs are, what to watch out for, and to be better prepared and more knowledgeable about this. Just nobody ever helped them to understand this a little bit better.
Yeah, and it seems like by the time that they're in a counselor's room or working with the pediatrician or whomever, that they missed a number of opportunities to have, headed things off before it reached that level,
I think that's true. Most of the kids that I worked with, because I worked at a large psychiatric hospital, the family had gotten into a crisis situation. It really had become either life-threatening or a crisis situation. And perhaps if they had known what to look for earlier, perhaps if they had intervened a little bit earlier, all of that could have been avoided. And that's really what the goal of education is all about, is to help us feel better prepared as a parent, as a grandparent, so that if we know what those warning signs are, perhaps we can intervene at an earlier stage and stop this from escalating so quickly.
Now, as we get into our discussion, what I'd love for you to do is walk us through the different types of addictions. These are definitely highlighted in your book, but it'd be helpful to understand a little bit more that we're not just talking drug addiction as a big umbrella, but there's different components within drug addiction, and as well as other addictions that youth are dealing with.
That is very true, and it is so important because I included a chapter on this entire issue called process addictions. We have chemical addictions, which are the alcohol and the drugs, alcohol, marijuana, and so on. Those are chemical addictions, what we call chemical addictions. But there's also another classification of addictions that we call process addictions. And I have an entire chapter in my book on process addictions because kids can get trapped into having really both a chemical addiction like marijuana and alcohol and a process addiction. And some examples of process addictions are eating eating disorders, self-injury, video gaming, cell phone use, even in the adult population, things like gambling, pornography, sexual behaviors. These are all in the classification of what we call process disorders. For adolescents, I think most of it occurs in things like video gaming, internet usage, cell phone usage, and things like that, more of the social media type of behavior. And just like the chemical addictions, these process addictions can become overwhelming, they can become compulsive, and they can really start to disrupt a teenager's life and the family's life as well.
And I liked how you pointed out in your book that there's a big difference between when an adult goes through some of the addictions, you have immediate feedback or almost immediate feedback in terms of the person's not showing up for work, the work quality is dropped off, they're not at home, they're withdrawn from friends. There's a number of things that are almost, like I said, not quite immediate, but definitely tells that friends and family might notice a lot faster than with addictions with youth.
Yes, that's true, because so many times with an adolescent, these behavioral changes that we see can be very subtle, and then they build up over time. And the other thing is sometimes parents and even grandparents, when they see these changes, they're very quick to assume, well, this is just normal adolescent acting out. This is what teenagers do. This is what way teenagers behave. And in a lot of cases, that's true. That is adolescent acting out, but in some cases it's an indication that there might be something deeper going on underneath the surface.
Right. And one of those things that you brought out in your book was that at these adolescent times, when you have hormones changing, everything's going on, that's when sometimes there may be issues of anxiety, depression, some of these brain chemical items that we're learning more and more about start to become more apparent. And so with chemical use or in some of the gaming and some of these things, it can all be somewhat hidden or accentuated based upon the addiction.
It can be, and in a lot of cases, certainly not all cases, but in a lot of cases, what we find when we really drill down on this is that a child is using a substance to medicate an underlying emotional issue. One example would be marijuana. Many of the children that I worked with who were using marijuana, smoking multiple times a day, when I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. So I think, in some cases, certainly not all cases, but in some cases, there's an underlying emotional reason that is driving that child to medicate that emotion or that thought or that feeling with a substance like marijuana.
Absolutely. Now, in your work with adolescents, did you find oftentimes, though, that they might be saying, hey, I've got this issue with anxiety or depression as a way to also, I don't know, get out of trouble? Because kids are very smart. There is this thing of getting caught, not wanting to face up to, hey, I don't know, breaking family rules or breaking rules or whatnot. And so if I can also put this anxiety to it, that helps to alleviate some of that.
It makes sense. It's not been my experience that kids would use that as an excuse to justify their use. They tended to use it as a reason why they were using it, not an excuse. And they certainly, at least the kids that I worked with, weren't making this up, because we were able to validate it through psychological testing and through other means that, yes, this child really does have an anxiety, or this child really is depressed, or this child really is has had an experience with trauma. So we don't take it on face value. We dig into it and do the testing and the interviewing and the psychological assessments to uncover whether or not there is that underlying issue. Sometimes there is, and sometimes there's not.
Okay. Now, in the case of, and I want to talk on some of the other substances, but in the case of marijuana or even some of the other substances, when you're talking about the kids would say, hey, this helps me with anxiety or the depression or something else, do they typically stumble upon marijuana giving them that benefit? Or was it something that maybe even friends or associates were telling them that, the individual taking the substance may have been saying, hey, I'm really depressed about something to some friends. And then somebody says, hey, this works for me. Why don't you give this a try?
I think that happens in some cases where, they're sharing with their friends how they feel. I feel anxious. I feel nervous. I feel upset. I feel depressed. And another child says, well, why don't you try marijuana? It worked for me. Or maybe they'll just say, well, why don't you try marijuana and see if it'll help? So in a lot of cases, I think, or in some cases, it can be that peer influence where somebody else has recommended it to them. Maybe they've tried it themselves. Maybe they're just curious. And in some cases, maybe the child has just on their own maybe stumbled into this. And once they find out it works, then they're likely to continue using it. So some of it's just experimentation to see what works and what doesn't work. And if it's anxiety and they come across marijuana, they may very well find that their anxiety is reduced. But what they don't understand about marijuana is what I saw in the psychological testing of these kids. When the psychological test came back, the processing speed of their brain was below average, their short-term memory was impaired, and their motivation was really very low. And that's an indicator of how marijuana has been working in their brain. There really was some consequences to their use. They didn't perhaps recognize all of that. They didn't see it because what they wanted was the relief from anxiety. But when we drilled down under it, we discovered these other issues that were going on as a result of marijuana. Was marijuana the sole cause of their processing speed being below average? Well, maybe not completely, but it was probably contributing to it.
Now, one of the things I thought was fascinating in the book, and even as we're talking about it now, is more of the science of understanding what the chemicals and what the drugs are doing to us. Because what you're describing to me is when I was taking my 6th grade health classes or whatnot, and they were showing us the movies or talking to us about the dangers of drugs, it was always talking about the classic burnout and the person that's using marijuana so much, and they're not very much the same, not motivated, slow on the uptake, these different types of traits. But I don't think at that time, and we're talking late 70s through mid 80s, I don't know if there was the science behind it as much as the observation of what was going on.
Yeah, I think that's very true. It was more the observation because we hadn't advanced enough to know a lot about the neuroscience of addiction that we now know, and I think it's very important that parents and grandparents read the chapter in my book on the neuroscience of addiction, because the bottom line to all of that is that the adolescent brain is in the process of maturing and developing. It doesn't become fully developed until around age 25. So the adolescent brain is growing, it's developing, it's forming those critical circuits that child will need as they move into adulthood. And these drugs, whether it's marijuana or any other drug, have the power to really change that child's brain, and not only to become addicted or controlled by the substance, but really can do some real damage to that developing brain. And understanding that very simple concept is important for parents and grandparents to grasp and understand. Parents and grandparents need to do everything that they can to protect their child's brain. And one of the things they can do is to help prevent that child from getting captured by these drugs, which can do so much damage to that developing brain.
I want to take a little bit of a step back and walk through the different drugs or the classifications of drugs that you outlined in the book, because it's not all the same. It's not just marijuana and then everything else. There's different drugs and different classifications of drugs.
Yeah, classifications. And that's such an important issue that I have a number of chapters in my book that are devoted to these different drugs. I wanted parents and grandparents to at least be a little familiar about what's out there. It's not that every child's going to get into some of these drugs. Kids are still attracted to marijuana and to alcohol. But in the last 3 years, we've seen a tremendous surge in adolescent vaping of things like nicotine and marijuana. In the last 3 years, there's been a dramatic increase in adolescents who are vaping substances like marijuana and nicotine. But I think it's good for parents and grandparents to at least have some basic knowledge of the drugs that are out there because they are so widely available. So I have different chapters that go through and try to help parents and grandparents know a little bit about what these drugs are, like what are inhalants, what are hallucinogens like LSD and mushrooms, and what are opiates, and what are prescription drugs that our kids are using like Ritalin and Adderall. So it just basically tries to give them a little bit better understanding of what's out there.
Oh, yeah. And folks, I'll be having links to Rick's book. It's called The Addicted Child, and it's about 100 pages. The chapters are really easy to consume. And it was a great reference for me because, as I said, there were some of these drugs where I thought were totally out of favor, but then there's still statistics that these things are still hanging around and even experimented with at different age groups and different age levels. So we'll be having links to all of this in the show notes. Now, one of the questions that I had on it is that how do we identify where addiction kicks in versus maybe experimentation?
That's a great question, and I point out in my book that addiction is not a diagnosis. If your child receives a diagnosis, they will not be diagnosed as an addict. That's a very stigmatizing term. So we don't diagnose adults or adolescents as being addicts. We use the term substance use disorder, and that recognizes that it's a disorder like any other medical condition. So we call it substance use disorder, and it can run on a continuum of mild to moderate to severe. And really what it boils down to is how many negative consequences we're seeing as a result of a child's use of a substance. The more negative consequences we see, the more likely the diagnosis moves from mild to moderate to severe. So for example, a child that might experiment with marijuana a few times but isn't using it on a regular basis might be in the mild or moderate category. A child who's smoking marijuana multiple times a day is probably going to be in the severe category. So that's sort of how we characterize substance use disorders today. We used to call it abuse and dependency, but we got away from that term, and now we use a substance use disorder that runs on that continuum of mild to moderate to severe.
Okay. And it seemed like too in the book that you're pointing out that there's different age groups where risk of addiction is higher and then it drops off as we get older, which follows along too with what I'm going back to my old health classes. Essentially, somebody that has never smoked cigarettes, by the time that they were like 18, 20 years old, it was almost like a zero chance that they would ever pick up and start becoming an active smoker.
Yes, and that's true.
Seemed like that was the case with your book, is that there was definitely a little bit of a spike around 14. And I may be remembering this wrong, a spike around 14, and then it starts leveling off the older they get. Obviously, after the high school years, if they hadn't been using or partaking of these substances or falling into different addictions, it would be following on.
That's true. Almost all addiction begins in adolescent years. Very few people get addicted to anything after, say, age 25, with the exception maybe of opioids as a result of having an injury and getting on pain medications and abusing them. But almost all addiction has its roots in the adolescent years, which are very vulnerable times for children. They're more likely to experiment with drugs. They're more likely to become addicted, so to speak, to using a substance in their adolescent years rather than their adult years. And that's why intervention, prevention, treatment is so important during the adolescent years. If we can get a child past their adolescent years and into their early 20s, early adulthood, the chances of them becoming captured by alcohol or drugs drops off significantly.
Now, during those years, are there things that parents and grandparents, I was a guy, so scouts, sports, things like that, those activities, being more involved and connected, does that also help to moderate any kind of substance use or abuse?
I think, learn the warning signs so you know what to look for as a parent or a grandparent. Know what the interventions are. Learn good communication skills. Learn good listening skills so that when you're talking to your child or to your grandchild, you're not just hearing their words, you're hearing the feelings behind those words. And just become more knowledgeable about this whole issue. Don't become paranoid about it. Don't become afraid of it, but just become knowledgeable. Knowledge is power. So the more knowledge that we have as a grandparent or as a parent, the more likely we are to be able to notice these changes that might indicate a child is moving towards a substance abuse issue.
With the grandparents and talking, since we're the Cool Grandpa podcast, how would grandparents best be able to support that family when there maybe is a substance use disorder going on, or they're even just trying to figure out if there is an issue? What are some things that grandparents can do, and then what are maybe some things that we shouldn't do?
Well, I think as grandparents, many times our grandchildren look to us for guidance. Look to us for advice, maybe even maybe more open to talking to us about issues that they're reluctant to talk to their parents about. Many kids fear being judged by their parents. Sometimes we as grandfathers and grandmothers can develop that trusting relationship with our grandchildren so that if there is an issue, they may very well come to us rather than their parents. And we need to be prepared to listen to them and to try and listen not just to their words, but to their feelings and have a discussion with them. If this becomes a crisis for the family, I think parents can play a very important supportive role for mom and dad so that they don't feel so isolated and so afraid and so alone, because many times parents need the support too. It's not just the kid who's going through the crisis, but the entire family is affected by this, and mom and dad are affected by it, and maybe, having their own crisis. And I think that the grandparents can sort of be a stabilizing influence on this. They can be a place that mom and dad can turn to for support and for some help, even if it's just as simple as, somebody to listen to, somebody to sit with. They can play a very important role in helping this family get through this crisis.
Absolutely. I think there's a big role that we can play in not only helping the child, but as you said, helping the grown children through it, because I'll guarantee you they haven't been through this before.
No.
And we can read books, but until you experience it, it's tough to know what to do and what to say, and everybody's second guessing themselves probably.
And that's why being knowledgeable in advance, knowing the information in advance, knowing what the plan to do in advance can sort of help stabilize that crisis situation. For just something as simple as maybe having read this book and knowing what the assessments are that you need to get done. I think that can be somewhat of an advantage, so that if you're in this situation, you don't have to run around trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next? Who do we need to see? What type of test do we need? It's all there for you to take a look at. And again, the more knowledge you have, the better prepared you are in the event that you're confronted with this issue, and maybe it's less of a crisis situation.
I absolutely love that. I'm a person that helps out with our county's disaster CERT group. And so we do a lot of training about what happens if you come up on a car wreck, or what happens if these things. And, most of us will never have that experience, but you go through and you read the material, you talk about it, you game plan a little bit for it, so that when it does come up, or if it does come up, you have the knowledge. And so you can even reach out for help yourself if you don't know what to do. At least hey, I can contact a pediatrician and we can start some of these assessments, and we can start some of this work and figure out, are we dealing with a mild case or a severe case?
Yeah, and you feel better prepared, I think, because you have a plan in place if needed. You know where you need to turn. You know what type of assessments you need. Maybe you've even read the book and you know how to look for a treatment program. There's an entire chapter in my book in terms of, okay, if you're looking at treatment, what kind of treatment programs do you look at? What are the questions you should ask a treatment provider? If your child has a severe substance abuse disorder and the plan is to send them to a residential placement, you have the questions in that book that you can ask that treatment place, so that you feel like you're getting the information that you need to make a decision. That's very important, because when you're in a crisis and you need to get help for your child, you may not have thought in advance of the questions that you need to ask a provider. And that's why having it in this reference can be helpful.
One of the things too I wanted to talk about was, what are some things from somebody that's had the experience that you have that, grandparents or parents should maybe stay away from when it comes to talking about substances? Because certainly I don't want to give bad information or certainly like we were talking about, give information that I learned back in 1978 to somebody now, where we've had 40 something years of science, so are there any suggestions or guidance about things to say or stay away from, or to your point, go get some help?
I think what I found worked with the adolescents that I was working with is, it didn't do me any good to tell them the drugs were illegal. It didn't do me any good to tell them that if they continued using the drugs, their grades would go down possibly, or they might not graduate from high school or get into college or get a job. They didn't believe any of that, and they didn't care about it. But what did work, what captured their attention, was the neuroscience. When I could talk to them about how their brain worked, what different areas of the brain were responsible for. This area is for speech. This area is for coordination. This one helps you to think more clearly. That they were interested in. They were interested in how their brain works. And then I would tie in and talk to them about how these drugs affect these different areas of the brain. I would show them, and I think I have this chart in the book, this picture of where marijuana attaches itself to the brain. That they were very interested in. So I think as grandparents and parents, we can play an important role in educating our children, not lecturing them, not telling them these drugs are illegal or bad. They already know that, but helping them to understand and appreciate the importance of protecting their brain and how their brain works. Because I think that's something that might capture their attention and they might be interested in. And grandparents can sit down, they can have a conversation, they can do some education on this, and they can help their children, their grandchildren, begin to understand the importance of protecting their brain.
Oh, that's great information, and important information too, because like I said, the last thing they need when being confronted or just talked about substances is getting more bad information, because they're certainly probably getting that from friends at school and, stories off the internet or whatnot.
That's a good point. You want to become, whether you're a parent or a grandparent, you want to become a source of information that the child trusts, that they can turn to and rely on, and not feel as if you're judging their behavior. If a child is using marijuana, they don't want to hear a judgment from you as a grandparent or even as a parent. They want you to listen to them, to hear their feelings, and maybe begin to have a conversation on why they're using the substance. Not a lecture, not telling them it's good or bad or any of this other negative stuff, but just a conversation to listen to, why are they using this? Help me understand why you're using this. And I think you're more likely to get a productive discussion if you start from that perspective. Help me understand why I'm seeing these things that I'm seeing.
Absolutely, because to your point earlier, that goes to the underlying issue that most of the time these substances are used for self-medication at some level. I mean, I think older kids with some of the ADHD meds, that becomes a little bit of gaming the system to stay up late and focus for finals, but that's not typically what the 15-year-old is using.
Right. And many times that underlying emotional issue goes unrecognized and undiagnosed. And the important thing is, if it's there, and if it is diagnosed, it needs to be treated just as much as the substance use needs to be treated. They both will need some type of treatment.
Now, how can grandparents best support a child that's going through treatment or has started that? And because it's a process, it's not a, hey, I'm taking my son or daughter to a treatment center and I'm picking them up in 3 or 4 weeks and then everything's better. There's a whole process behind that.
I think grandparents can play a critical role in getting that child into treatment by being encouraging and by being supportive. Chances are the child is not going to want to go into treatment. Chances are that the child is going to resist even going to counseling, much less a treatment program. Just about every kid that I treated in the hospital didn't want to be there. They fought tooth and nail to come into the hospital, but their parents held the ground and they knew that this was something that had to be done. And I think grandparents can play an important role in supporting the entire family, not just the kids, but mom and dad as well. And everybody, mom, dad, grandparents are all moving in the same direction. They're all supporting the same goal, which is to get treatment or to get help for this child. And then when it comes to the child itself, grandparents can play a very crucial role in encouraging that child to enter treatment, to stay in treatment, to reinforce the positive aspects of them, to let them know that they're proud of their grandchild, taking this step, and really be an influential source in not only that child going into treatment, but that child staying in treatment and completing treatment. And then when the child comes out of treatment, grandparents can play a crucial role in helping that child maintain their sobriety.
Are there things that, as this process is going on, that grandparents shouldn't be doing? And what pops into my mind is this idea of, hey, if you go in and you do treatment and you work the program, then we'll take that 2-week trip to Hawaii, or we'll do, where there's almost is putting a carrot out there the wrong thing to be doing in a situation like this?
No, I don't think it's the wrong thing to do. I think sometimes we tend to focus on punishment. If you smoke the marijuana again, this is what's going to happen to you, which sends a real negative message. And certainly there need to be consequences for a child that relapses and begins using again. But I think also there needs to be rewards for maintaining abstinence so that the child isn't isn't always confronted with punishment. Well, if you start smoking again, you're going to lose your car. You're going to get restricted even more. Okay, certainly there's consequences to relapses, but we often neglect the other side, which is if you're able to maintain your sobriety, if you're able to stay away from these substances, I'm going to recognize that too. And I think that that's an accomplishment that needs to be rewarded as well. And maybe the parents and the grandparents can negotiate with the child what those rewards should be so that they feel like they're participating in this treatment as well.
Okay. Because I was a little bit worried in terms of it becomes almost too much of a bribe of you get the behavior you want, but it's only because of promise of the trip or the promise of something, and the youth isn't really going through the healing process to be healed.
Yeah. And I think you have to be careful of that. I think what you want to focus on is, the acknowledging the child's progress. And it doesn't have to be some great fancy reward. Sometimes just a simple verbal compliment is enough to help that child continue. Because remember, I think at the bottom line is kids mostly want the approval of their parents and their grandparents, especially their grandparents. So that approval means a lot to kids. And the reward doesn't have to be a trip. It doesn't have to be money. It doesn't have to be something expensive. It can be just praise. It can be, hey, I'm proud of you for the work that you're doing. I'm proud of the work and the effort that I'm seeing here. That means more to kids sometimes than a financial reward. The praise of their grandparents means a lot to these kids.
Oh yeah, a nice one-on-one trip to get a burger, and then hearing that from the grandfather of like, hey, I know you've had it rough. I see what you're doing, and this is great work, and it's hard work, and those words mean as much as probably a ticket to Hawaii.
Absolutely. It may be even more, because that's something that kid down the road, when they get to be older, they may very well remember that trip to get that burger and the time that they spent with their grandfather or their grandmother and how much it meant to them. I agree. I think that can be powerful in influencing these kids.
Now, another question that I had for you was, and you mentioned in your book, and it's a little bit of a, and I almost think I know what your answer is going to be, but as far as grandparents sharing some of their past with the children that might be in a substance issue, meaning there's understanding like, hey, when I was in high school, I tried marijuana too, or I got drunk too, or doing some of those things where you're talking about some of that past. What is some of your recommendation on sharing some of those things?
Well, depending on the age appropriateness of the child, I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with a parent or a grandparent sharing their experience of using a substance. Obviously, you don't want to glorify it, but you may have had some negative experiences with it as well, and you could very easily explain to them, when I was your age and I experimented with this, it gave me sort of a good feeling, but what I didn't know now that you have the advantage of knowing was how it affected my brain. Okay. When I was your age, I knew nothing about the brain. I knew nothing about how these drugs worked in the brain. I know that now. And if I'd known that when I was your age, I probably would have stayed away from these substances because I had no idea of how harmful they could be to my brain, which was developing. So that's the big difference between when I was growing up and when you're growing up. You now have the benefit of knowing how these substances can hurt your brain. I didn't know that when I was doing it. If I had, I probably never would have touched the stuff.
That's great advice, because you certainly, as you said, don't want to glorify it and then make it seem like, hey, this is something, keep going. But then also sharing those stories of the negativity that can come from it. And especially from doing some of these things to excess. Because they
and if you did notice in your life that it did get to the point where it was out of control and it had some really nasty consequences, you can share that. I mean, they need to know that sometimes bad things happen with people who use substances.
Well, and to your point too, is that's information going to them about a family member. You know, it's not another 15 or 16-year-old who got, you know, really drunk and threw up in somebody's car. It's, hey, this was my grandfather way back when who had these issues. It's, I don't know, it's different information. I think maybe a little bit more powerful than the joking around with having an acquaintance that had a bad experience.
Yeah, especially if it's approached in a serious conversation. You know, it's not a funny conversation. It's a conversation of, you know, I want to share with you my experience when I was using marijuana or when I was drinking alcohol and what that meant to me at that time.
Now, along with the book, The Addicted Child, are there other resources that you would recommend for grandparents or parents to either, you know, have a bookmark on the website or something along those lines?
There's a companion parent workbook that I would recommend grandparents get a copy of as well, because I recognize that that parents need help with this too, and grandparents as well, because you know, as grandparents, if we have a child who's struggling with alcohol and drugs, that's affecting us. It's affecting us emotionally, just as it's affecting the parents emotionally. And I wrote this very brief parent workbook to help parents and grandparents work through the emotions and the feelings that they're having when they recognize that they've got a grandson or a granddaughter or a son or a daughter who's using substances. So it helps them journal and go through these emotions that they're feeling. It has some examples of how to cope with anxiety. It has some examples on how to communicate with your grandchild. You know, we're very good, Greg, at when we listen to each other or we listen to our children or our grandchildren, we're very good at listening and hearing their words, but we're not so good at hearing the feelings that are behind those words. And that's a skill that every grandparent can learn and practice, and every parent can learn and practice, so that when we're talking to our children or our grandchildren, we're not just hearing their words, we're hearing the feelings behind those words. And when we can do that, we form a stronger connection. There's a couple of examples in that workbook on how you can do that. So I would encourage every grandparent to get the main book for the education, but also pick up a copy of the workbook, work through, look at the exercises, and just have it as another resource that's available for you if you need it.
Oh, that's great. And I'll be sure to put links to the books and the website in the show notes as well.
Great.
Now, is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to bring up that maybe I forgot to ask, or something important that we need to address?
Well, I think what I would add is a sense of hope that regardless of what the family is going through, regardless of the age of the child and the substance that's being abused and the consequences that are being faced, that there is hope. Our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves once we get away from abusing them with substances. And the adolescent brain has a remarkable capacity to heal itself. So my message to grandparents and to parents is a message of hope that you can get through this. Knowledge is power. Don't be paranoid about this. Don't be afraid of it, but grab the knowledge, learn the knowledge, feel better prepared, so that if you are confronted with this issue, you feel better prepared to deal with it. You know more about it than what you did before. You know what resources are available, and you feel better equipped and more confident to deal with it.
Well, that's great advice, and I appreciate that. And Rick, I really wanted to also say thank you so much for coming on the Cool Grandpa podcast. It's been an enlightening conversation, and to your point, I know the listeners are going to be more knowledgeable having gone through this and more prepared to help the grandchildren and help the children through what is going to be a difficult time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you, Greg, taking the time to participate in the discussion with me and to add your own insights and your own observations, which I think are always helpful. And I'm hopeful that that every grandparent, every parent that listens to our discussion will hopefully walk away feeling a little bit more confident, less afraid, and perhaps take the time to do the reading. I kept it to 107 pages, so it's not going to take a lot of time, and hopefully feel better prepared and more hopeful that if they're confronted with this issue, they feel better prepared now than what they did before.
Oh, absolutely. And more updated information, as we were talking, certainly more updated than when, I don't know, I left those health classes back in the 80s.
Yeah, things have changed since I was in school many years ago, and hopefully there is better information out there now for both parents and grandparents.
Absolutely. Stay on the line and I'll say goodbye off the air, but thanks again for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate your time.
What an interesting conversation we just had. One of the biggest takeaways that I had was, and it's something I probably have known, but that adolescents and children oftentimes don't respond to the negative parts of being tried to put down or modify behavior when it comes to substance abuse. I mean, we can tell people not to do drugs. We can tell people not to do what we consider negative behaviors. And we can do that all we want, but a lot of times people are doing these activities as a way to self-medicate an underlying problem and an underlying issue. And what I thought was fascinating and a great reminder was that the science part that a counselor can bring to the table to talk to an adolescent about what's going on with their brain and what happens when they're taking these substances or engaging in these negative behaviors is something that was really fascinating, and something that also reminds me that I'm not equipped to have that discussion with a grandchild, that it takes going through the pediatrician and it takes going through the counselors and getting people that actually know the science to be able to have those conversations with the child. Because what is oftentimes the case is the child, there's probably a lot of shame going on with that addiction. There's a lot of not knowing how the relationship is going to survive once the addiction is brought into the light. But having a third party, such as a counselor, pediatrician, or whatnot, can really help just to even educate that child about what's going on with the addiction. And then also use those assessment tools that Rick had talked about to figure out what's going on. Is there depression? Is there anxiety? Is there something else? What do we get to the underlying part of the issue? Because most of the time the substance use or abuse is just covering up an underlying condition. What I want you guys to do is go to the show notes at cool-grandpa.us, look for this episode, and go to the comments section and leave me a comment about what your big takeaway was from this conversation. Also, if you have questions for Rick, be sure to leave those in the comments as well, and I will work with Rick to either get you in touch with him or to answer those questions, and we can share those in the comments section so it can help other people. Until next time, I want you guys to remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.